Well, if I'm going to pitch a religion and I say it's very peaceful, you say, sounds good, let me check out the track record and see how this religion has performed in the past. Well, we just happen to have a 1,400-year track record of Islam, and that's what I put together in this book. Muhammad was born in 570 AD over in Asia, in Arabia, and in the 570 AD, Christianity's been around for 570 years pretty much, and there were lots of other different religions. No, Muhammad was illiterate. His whole life he could not read and write, and his father died before he was born. His mother died when he was 6. His grandfather and guardian died when he was 8, so he was taken in by his uncle, who was a textile merchant and would go on camel rides. And so Muhammad would go with his uncle to Mecca. And Mecca was a pagan city. There were over 360 different pagan gods in Mecca, the most popular being the moon god. They thought this rock had fallen from the moon, so they put it into a square building called the Kaaba, and they would kiss the rock, walk around the rock, bow to the rock 5 times a day, and 1 month out of the year they would fast toward this rock. And their calendar began with the first sight of the crescent moon. And then Muhammad would go with his uncle on camel rides to Persia, to Baghdad, and hear about their Zoroastrian religion. Well, the Zoroastrians, the Magi, the magic, that's where the 3 wise men came from. Anyway, the Zoroastrians believed that paradise was filled full of virgins that would fulfill all your desires. And the Zoroastrians believed that there were jinns or genies. These were spirits that would follow you around, and for good or bad. Matter of fact, a genius was not somebody with a high IQ. It was somebody that had a jinn that followed them around and told them all the answers. Anyway, then Muhammad would go and hear some of the other religions. There was Manichaeism, a very popular faith that started in the 2nd century, where a guy named Mani combined some Buddhism with some Zoroastrianism with some Jewish and Christian beliefs. And then Muhammad heard about the Jewish faith. And Medina was a Jewish trading city. It was called Yatrib. And the Jews had their written law, but Muhammad was illiterate, so he could not read it. But he heard about their oral traditions, their Talmud and their Midrash. Things like the Apocalypse of Abraham and the Book of Enoch. These are not in our Old Testament, but they've been passed down with oral traditions. And lo and behold, some of those stories Muhammad heard, and they found their way into Islamic faith. And the most interesting influence on Muhammad was the Christian influence. Now, Encyclopedia Britannica says the gospel was made known to Muhammad chiefly through apocryphal and heretical sources. So Muhammad thought the Trinity was the Father, Mary, and Jesus, not the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. And the apocryphal sources, there was the infancy gospel of Thomas that was written in the 2nd century. Now, this is a fanciful story of what would have happened if Jesus was a little boy. No scholar has ever taken this serious, and it's written by somebody who obviously knows nothing of Jewish life. And yet, in this infancy gospel of Thomas, there's a story of Jesus speaking from the cradle. Well, guess what story Muhammad heard, and it found its way into the Quran, that Jesus spoke from the cradle. That Mary was accused of fooling around, and she said, I didn't fool around, asked the baby, and they said, how could we talk to the baby? He's only 40 days old. And then Jesus answered from the cradle and says, I'm Jesus, the prophet of Allah, and no, she didn't fool around. Then the infancy gospel of Thomas has a story about Jesus making clay birds and clapping, and they flew away. Guess what story Muhammad heard, and it found its way into the Quran? Jesus clapped and made clay birds, and they flew away. And then in the infancy gospel of Thomas, there's a story about Jesus playing with some playmates. One of them fell off the roof of a house. They accused Jesus of pushing him. Jesus raised the kid from the dead. The kid said, Jesus didn't push me off, the other one did. Guess what story Muhammad heard and found its way into Islamic belief, that Jesus was playing with some playmates. One of them died. They accused Jesus of doing it. Jesus raised the kid from the dead, and the kid said, Jesus didn't do it, the other one did. Now, there's no other place in ancient literature that these stories appear other than the infancy gospel of Thomas, which nobody took serious and nobody today takes serious. But Muhammad heard those, and they found their way into Islamic faith, and now they're taken as fact. And so we can sort of trace the influences that existed in the world that Muhammad heard. But the most interesting part was the fact that in the area where Muhammad lived, there were lots of heresies. Christian heresies, mostly confused over the nature of Christ. Now, for Orthodox Christians, this was settled at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, and where Jesus is of one substance with the Father. You know, the Nicene Creed, the Trinity. Well, over in Arabia, there were Nestorians. And the Nestorians believed Jesus was mostly God and just a little bit man. And then there were Arians, who believed that Jesus was mostly man and just a little bit God. Then there were Docetists, who believed he was completely God and only appeared human. And then there were Monophysites, who believed he was God and man in one body, but they never mixed. And then there were Ebionites, who believed Jesus was completely man, yet he was the Messiah. You can sort of see how confusing this would be to somebody that could not read or write. Anyway, so Muhammad was married to his first wife, Khadijah, by her cousin, who was an Ebionite Christian priest of this heretical sect. And so he would hear these different stories and trying to put together a worldview. Now, his wife was 40 years old, widowed twice and wealthy, and he was 25. And so when he married her, he did not have to work, and so he would go out to caves and pray. And so in 610 AD, he went out to a cave around Mecca and prayed. And a spirit, now this was not uncommon. There were desert fathers in the early 5th century that would try to copy the example of John the Baptist or Elijah and go out in caves and pray. So he was simply following their example. Anyway, he's out in this cave, and he gets visited by a jinn or a spirit. And this is what the Surah 96, 1-3 says, that the spirit appeared to him and commanded him to read. And he said, I cannot read. And the spirit took him and squeezed him vehemently and then let him go and then ordered him to read. He said, I cannot read. The spirit squeezed him again till he was exhausted and said, read. He said, I cannot read. And then he began to recite. And that's how the Quran came to Muhammad. He would get these thoughts into his mind. He would repeat them over and over again and then teach them to his followers. Then he'd get another thought into his mind, repeat it over and over again, teach it to his followers. And now none of his followers could write, so the Quran was not written down till actually 3 caliphs after Muhammad. And Muhammad returned with the inspiration to his wife, and it says his neck muscles were twitching with terror. That's what the Hadith says. Now the Quran is private revelations to Muhammad. The Hadith are stories remembered about Muhammad from his wives and warriors. After Muhammad's death, he had anywhere from 11 to 22 wives, and they would remember things that he said. And so those were put down into what's called the Hadith. And then there's the first biography of Muhammad that was written about 100 years later, called the Sirat Rasul Allah. Anyway, in the Hadith, it says that Muhammad's neck muscles were twitching with terror, and he came upon his wife and said, cover me, cover me. They covered him till his fear was over, and he said, Oh Khadijah, what is wrong with me? Oh Khadijah, I see light, I hear sounds, I fear I am mad. And then Muhammad became suicidal, and it says in the Hadith al-Bukhari that he went up to the top of a mountain to throw himself off and kill himself. He said this, I thought, woe is me, poet or possessed, never shall Quraysh, which was the name of his tribe, say this of me. I will go to the top of the mountain and throw myself down that I may kill myself and gain rest. So he went forth and did so, but midway up the mountain, the spirit would appear to him and say, O Muhammad, thou art a prophet of Allah. Anyway, the wife Khadijah took him to that cousin that married them, and he said, well, maybe this was a spirit that appeared to Moses, and a week later that guy died. And so Muhammad was left fellowshipping with this spirit. And the first set of verses that came to Muhammad were called Meccan verses because they were revealed to him when he was in Mecca. And the second set of verses came to Muhammad were called Medina verses because they came to him when he was in Medina. Now it's easy to remember which ones come first because if you spell it Mecca, it's M-E-C, and Medina is M-E-D. Now the Meccan verses were more peaceful, where he says there's no compulsion in religion, that if he had any doubts about the revelation, he should ask the people of the book, the Christians and the Jews. And believe it or not, for the first 17 months of Islam, he had them bowing toward Jerusalem, like the prophet Daniel when he was in Babylon. Anyway, then Muhammad was rejected. He was very excited about his faith. He would come into Mecca and share it. He thought there's something in it for everybody. Something for the Jews, something for the Christians, something for the Zoroastrians, something for the pagans. And they were not excited about his new faith, and fighting broke out, and so he had to flee. So in the year 622 AD, Muhammad fled from Mecca to Medina. And this is called the Hijra, the flight, and it is year 1 in the Muslim calendar. So our year 1 is 1 AD when Jesus was born. The Muslims' year 1 is the flight, the Hijra, when he fled from Mecca to Medina. Now once he gets to Medina, Medina again is a Jewish trading city. And this is when he gets these new set of verses that are revealed to him. And he makes a treaty with the 3 Jewish tribes that are there. Sort of an I'll help protect you if you help protect me type of treaty. And The Jews should have thought about it, but they didn't. But they entered into this treaty. A year or so later, the Meccans come to Medina and attack it to kill Muhammad. And the siege is laid, and after about a week, it gets freezing cold, and the Meccans give up and go back to Mecca, and Muhammad considers it a victory. And then he wonders why the Jews were not too quick to come to his defense. And so he took this as an opportunity to break the treaty, and it set a precedent in Islam that when you are weak, you make treaties until you can get strong enough to disregard them. And so Muhammad broke the treaty, and the Spirit appeared to him and said, how can you rest when Allah's enemies are in your midst? And so that's when he bottled up the Jews in their neighborhood there in Medina. And the first biography of Muhammad, the Sirat Rasul Allah, says, then the Jews surrendered, and the apostle confined them in Medina in the quarter of Dul al-Harith. And then the apostle went into the market of Medina and dug trenches in it, and he sent for the Jews and struck off their heads in those trenches as they were brought out to him in batches. There were 600 or 700 in all, though some put the figure as high as 800 or 900. As they were being taken out in batches to the apostle, they asked Ka'b what he thought would be done with them. He replied, will you never understand? Don't you see the summoner never stops, and those who are taken away do not return? By Allah, it is death. This went on until the apostle made an end of them. It goes on to say, Zohir, an aged Jew who had saved some of Muhammad's allies, was interceded for and granted a pardon. But what hath become of our Jewish chiefs of Ka'b, Huwi, Asa ibn Samuel? Asked the old man. As one after another he named the leading chiefs of his tribe, he received the reply that they had been slain already. Then of what use is life to me any longer? Slay me also, that I may join those who have preceded me. When this was told to Muhammad, he said, yea, he shall join them in the fire of hell. And he too was beheaded. And so this began the Medina chapter of Muhammad's life, which was more violent. He changed the direction of bowing from Jerusalem to Mecca, and then he went out to fight in 45 battles. He led 27 of the battles. And he actually used the catapult when he would attack cities, like the city of Al-Taif. And when he was told that women and children were in the cities, he responded by saying, they are among them. In other words, they get to be killed too. So today, suicide bombers say it's okay to kill innocent people to advance Islam because Muhammad killed innocent people when he used the catapult, when he attacked the cities like Al-Taif. And it's interesting how the verses, these revelations came to him, and they could change from time to time. So after his wife Khadijah died, Muhammad went on to marry anywhere from 11 to 22 wives. And he got a fifth of the women taken in battle. Muhammad said, married women are forbidden unto you except those taken in battle. They had another verse where in the hadith, his servant was asked how he could satisfy all of his wives, and the servant said Muhammad could visit all his wives in an hour round, and there were 11 in number because he had the strength of 30 men. And anyway, Muhammad had a different night with every wife, and sometimes he would miss his turn with a wife because he'd be with a new one, and the wives would begin to grumble. And so he gets a verse revealed to him. It's Surah 33:30 that says, O consorts of the Prophet, if any of you were guilty of evident unseemly conduct, the punishment would be double for her, for this is easy for Allah. And so after this, the wives would not grumble if Muhammad missed his turn with them. Muhammad said that women can be married for religion, for fortune, or for beauty, so marry one for religion. And so he said that they could have at least 4 wives, and if you could afford it, you could have more than that. Anyway, one of his wives, Aisha, was 6 years old when he married her. Some say she was 9 when they consummated it. But Aisha was Muhammad's favorite wife. And sometimes some of the other wives wouldn't want to spend their night with him because they were overweight and were afraid they were going to get divorced. So they'd send Aisha in. But Aisha's father was Abu Bakr. And Abu Bakr is the founder of the Sunnis. 90% of the Muslims are Sunnis. And then Muhammad had a daughter named Fatima, and Fatima was married to Ali, and Ali is the founder of the Shiites, or it's actually pronounced Shi-Ali, or Party of Ali. And 10% of the Muslims are Shiite, and most of them live in Iran. And so the whole Sunni Shiite fighting was the father-in-law's followers versus the son-in-law's followers, sort of like who's going to get control of this ultimate family power here. Anyway, so Muhammad fights in all these different battles. It's interesting when you go through, one of them is the Battle of Khaybar in 627 AD, where the Jewish chief Kiana would not tell where the tribe's treasure was hidden. So Muhammad had him brought out and kindled a fire on his chest till he was almost expired to torture him to get him to tell where the treasure was hidden. And then finally, Muhammad gave him over to be beheaded. And then he took the chief's wife and brought him by the decapitated body of her husband, and then he slept with her that night. And the Sultan would follow Muhammad's example and would get a fifth of the spoils and a fifth of the women taken in battle. It's interesting. When I would write articles on this and print it, there's one on WorldNet Daily, I got an email back from one of the Muslims, and I talked about how when Muhammad entered Mecca in 630 AD, he ordered 10 people to be murdered upon his entrance to the city. And this person emailed me back and said, well, he showed restraint because he could have had all of them be killed. So they were just trying to, anyway, so it's interesting. Now, one of the things I think it's helpful to understand is that where the Quran is a private revelation to Muhammad, the Bible is 40 inspired writers over a 1,600-year period of time. And so you can see a track record that runs through it. Jesus never killed anybody. Muhammad killed an estimated 3,000 people, including cutting off the heads of those 700 in Medina. Jesus never led armies. Muhammad led armies. He fought in 45 battles. Jesus never owned slaves. Muhammad got a fifth of the slaves taken in battle. Jesus never married. Muhammad had anywhere from 11 to 22 wives, plus the concubines. And there's a verse in the Quran that says, Allah has given you the slave girls for your booty. Now, if you point this out to a faithful Muslim, they won't deny it. They'll just respond by saying, David was a prophet, yet he led armies and killed people and owned slaves and had lots of wives. And my response is, yeah, but Jesus didn't. And Christians go back to Christ. And I said, besides, David just wanted his little plot of geography. There's no command for the Jews to subdue the world and bring it into submission to Yahweh. And then there's even more differences if you look at it a little bit closer. The Jews have the concept of the punishment fits the crime. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Well, in Islam, it says to cut off the hand of a thief. So in other words, the punishment is a whole lot more than a crime. Islam says in Surah 434, if your wife disobeys you, you can beat her. And so you see that there's a difference there. Now, Jesus taught that God was our Father. Muhammad taught it's blasphemy to call Allah your Father. Jesus taught we're made in God's image. Muhammad said Allah has no image. Jesus taught to forgive trespasses. Muhammad taught to avenge trespasses. Jesus had his apostles. None of the apostles led armies. Every one of the caliphs led armies. The caliph is the supreme military and religious leader in Islam. Now, it's interesting. Jesus was a religious leader, besides being what I believe the Son of God. But Muhammad was a religious leader and a military leader. He was a general. So, in other words, the effort today to split the militant side of Islam away from the religious side of Islam is we're trying to split Muhammad, because he was both a military leader and a religious leader. So, in other words, what would Jesus do? The closer you get to imitating Jesus' example, the more peaceful you are. The closer you get to imitating Muhammad's example, the more militant you are. So you can look through history. For the first 300 years of Christianity, there were 10 major persecutions, and Christians were thrown to the lions, and they never once led an armed resistance. The first 300 years of Islam, they conquered huge areas of the world that I'm going